You're listening to the Friday Sports Show on Salford City Radio 94.4 FM. The Friday Sports Show. Your host, Jimmy Petruzzi, bring you local news from a local area, bringing you news from around the world. We feature some of the world's leading athletes, speak to some of the world's best athletes, sports people across a wide range of disciplines. We also speak to coaches and trainers and people in the field of sport across a variable range of disciplines. But we also have a segment speaking to some of the world's most influential people in the field of psychology and related fields who share their insights and their expertise and really interesting thoughts. Today I have a very special guest, a sport no doubt we all, we've all sort of at least watched when the Olympic comes around, that's for sure, and it's a phenomenal sport, and GB has a strong tradition in this sport as well. So we're going to find out more about what it involves. So Melissa Wilson, a GB rower, she's also a team leader at Champions for the Earth. We'll find out a bit more about what that involves. Welcome to the show. Great to have you on board.
Thank you, Jim. Good to be here.
Good to speak to you, Melissa. Let's start with rowing. How did you get into rowing? Where did it all begin for you? This is one of the questions I ask many athletes, and it always intrigues me in terms of how did you sort of get into rowing?
Yeah, well, I was actually really not good at sport at school. I used to avoid it as much as possible and lacked a lot of coordination and wasn't very confident. I've been, any of the sports I came across growing up. So it was only actually when I went to university that I thought, there was a river I was through in Cambridge, river running through the city, lots of willow trees, and it looked really nice, and I thought, maybe it would be a good way to spend time outside during my degree.
Brilliant. And at what point did you think, I've got some, I've got an opportunity here to sort of go to the highest level, Melissa? At what point did you think,
Definitely not immediately. I think I turned up at the kind of session for beginners, and some older third years kind of looked at me and my new friend and said, "Oh, you're both really tall. Like maybe you'd be good at this." And I think that was the first time that somebody had said ever in a sporting context, "Oh, maybe this is something that you'd be good at." And then probably a couple of months later, we had to do our first test on the rowing machine, and I did my test, and I tried to. All of the rest of the club and all the athletes from different university years would gather around everybody who was doing their tests and kind of yell and cheer them on, and I thought that looked really horrible. So I got on an erg in the corner and pretended I was doing a warm-up, and then just set my screen to the 2 kilometres that you need to row, and then just started going. And it was only kind of midway through that some of the other students realised what I was doing and started cheering me, and at the end one of them said, "Well, actually that's only 30 seconds off what you'd need to be part of the under 23 squad, and you should really keep going with this." So I think it was kind of from then on that I started trying to bring my score down and think more seriously about training for the as part of the boat race program and things like that.
Yeah, no, that shows the importance of talent ID, I think, Melissa, where there's athletes out there, no doubt they can excel in different fields, and that sort of shows the importance of giving the opportunity. That's one thing that we try and champion on this show, is to sort of cast the net wide, and in terms of getting people involved in different sports, not necessarily going to achieve the level that you are, but just being the best you can be, and who knows where the road will take you type thing. But in terms of yourself, what sort of are your aspirations going forward? I mean, obviously, let's start with your highlights. What would you say your highlights have been so far? Before we discuss aspirations, what would you say your highlights have been? No doubt you've had plenty of highlights, but what would you say your main ones are?
Well, just quickly, I thought I'd pick up on what you were saying about the importance of involvement, and I think that's something positively that rowing is increasingly trying to do, and I'm sure it's the same across a lot of sports, but definitely in the past I think rowing and some other sports have had certain not a stigma, but an assumption made about them that you need to be from a certain background in order to participate in them. And I think that's something that British rowing is really doing quite good things to try to address. So they've started a Love Rowing campaign. I'm signed up to do it next week. It runs for a week, and they're trying to raise quite significant amounts of money to make sure that participation can be improved across club levels. And now I know that after London as well, there was a big push to get more people involved in club level rowing. So now most people should be within a reasonable distance of a rowing club, and most clubs are pretty good now. If you get in touch by email or even kind of wander down to the club, more often than not, I think there'd be somebody who would happily chat to you about how you could get involved, and there's lots of learn to row courses and things like that. So I think that's a really positive thing, that just like me and wandering down to the boat club and not feeling like this was going to be anything that I was going to have kind of natural aptitude for. I think we really want to get more and more people feeling like, actually, I'm just going to go and have a go, and there's not kind of roadblocks in the way of me doing that.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, I guess in answer to your question about highlights, I guess finished my first degree around 2015, and by that time I'd done a few boat races and won a couple of under 23 medals at the World Championships, and then I took the 2015-16 year out to try to get into the Rio squad, and I got taken on as part of the team around that kind of December 2015 time, and so got to train with the athletes that then went on to kind of win a silver in the 8 and a silver in the double and a gold in the pair, which was a great learning time for me. And then I went back to university, back to Cambridge, and was part of their winning boat race crew that year, and also went to my first senior world championships that summer, where me and my crewmate from Cambridge, we came 4th in the world in the women's pair. It was a really exciting summer for us because we were rowing. The pair had a lot of success the previous 2 Olympiads. Helen Glover and Heather Stanning had won gold in London, the first gold of the London Olympics, and then had managed to repeat that feat in Rio. And so we were kind of getting to train in their boats and race in their boats, and that was full of excitement for us. Especially my teammate Holly had actually come into rowing inspired by that London 2012 summer, so she'd watched, we both had watched Helen and Heather winning in those races, and then the fact that we were kind of training in that same boat was a really exciting piece for us.
Absolutely. Yeah. What was it like, the experience itself? It must have been invaluable for you, Melissa, to be in that environment around, some of the world's best athletes. And did you feel that you sort of learnt a lot from being in that environment?
Yeah, definitely. I think that cohort had a lot of really, really experienced athletes. So Catherine Granger was going to her 5th Olympics, as was Fran Houghton. There were several girls in the 8s who had been to at least another Olympics, often 2, like Beijing and London. I just tried to act like a sponge as much as possible and soak up that experience, but also seeing, learning from them on the water, but also off the water. I was kind of on one of the lowest levels of funding, which was still really helpful, but I think it worked out at like £10 a day to live off. So I didn't really have any money to pay rent. I didn't have a lot of spare cash, and lots of those, there were kind of 2 or 3 athletes who were letting me like hop from spare room to sofa to spare room, including like Heather Stanning, who was one of the most successful athletes in the team. And I think that sort of attitude of like they were all preparing to go and excel at an Olympic Games, and they were still happy with relatively new 23-year-olds coming along and living with them for a bit. So I think that was a broader lesson as well about the type of person that I'd want to be, the type of teammate I'd want to be.
Absolutely. And in terms of yourself, obviously GB's got a strong tradition in rowing and some great rowers over many years. And what's it feel like for you, Melissa? I suppose in one sense the sort of the baton over to you type thing, and how do you sort of feel in terms of stepping up and sort of fulfilling your own aspirations, and what are your sort of thoughts around sort of being in amongst all a country of a strong tradition in that sport? And
yeah, I think that's always been hugely inspiring. I guess to bring the story up till now, I had gone back to university, done another degree, but had competed at the World Championships 2017, 2018, 2019, and had qualified the women's quad in 2019 for the Tokyo Games, and the next March was selected as part of the Tokyo Olympic squad for the rowing team. And then a few days later the games were postponed, and since then I've had a series of 3 or 4 different injuries, and so I'm not going to be part of the Tokyo cohort this year. And I think in some ways, training in a building where there's success and people accomplishing their Olympic dreams all over the walls, and there's a lot of history, in some ways can make it quite hard when your story doesn't pan out in quite the same way. But I think that's partly why it's so valuable to have the extra experiences around that of training with such high caliber people, and recognizing that there's a lot that goes into being a high caliber person, almost not so much aside from high level performance, but alongside it. And I think when the environment is right, you end up with a collective of people who are kind of, I'm still willing the rest of the team on this summer, and there becomes less of a boundary between kind of your goals and the team's goals, and you can kind of feel the momentum of what the team's going to achieve carrying on through, almost regardless of the part that you're going on to play in that.
No, absolutely. And in terms of training, you sort of touched on training there, and I guess the margins are sort of fine in at the level that you compete at, Melissa. And obviously there are things you can control, things that you can't control, obviously injuries and certain things like that, and there's situations that are beyond your control. But what's it like training physically? What for a role? What sort of, if you give us an insight in terms of what's it like training physically? What sort of training do you do?
Yeah, sure. Yeah. So normally pre-COVID, we'd have been training 3 times a day most days. You'd have 90 minutes to 2 hours on the water, then maybe you'd have an hour or just over an hour session on the rowing machine, and then you'd have an hour to 2 hours in the gym with weights, and there'd be pieces throughout the week where you're kind of competing against each other on the water, on the rowing machine, and a lot of the time around that there's almost an equal emphasis on what you're doing to recover, so your whole day ends up really often revolving around the performances that you're trying to create, because you finish the 3 sessions and partly you don't have the energy to do much else, but partly you know that the only way you're going to complete the sessions to the best of your ability the next day is by heading home and having a pretty low-key evening. So I guess that's what things would have looked like, and are starting to look like a little bit more now, and can look a bit more like, especially when the team's away on training camps. But during COVID, things ended up being quite different for us. So we were all kind of spread to different corners of the UK, training out of garages, and I was living with a teammate and her parents, and we were like sticking bars up into a tree so that we could do pull-ups, and finding plastic buckets half filled with concrete from a nearby scrapyard that we could use for deadlifts and things like that. So I think partly in view of that, the coaches reduced the sessions, so we were kind of just doing 2 sessions a day, but it's still, especially once the games had been postponed, it was quite a mental challenge to make sure that you still got the most out of those 2 sessions each day when the Olympiad you trained for 4 years had suddenly become 5, and at that stage we weren't even sure kind of what this year would look like.
Yeah, and absolutely. I can imagine it would have been very challenging in terms of the preparation, and having trained for so long, and obviously the sort of periodization of training, and many challenges that it sort of presented. And in terms of, you talked about the mental side of things, and do you do mental skills training as well? Do you prepare mentally for races as well, or?
Yes, there's a team psychologist, and so I think a full-time psychologist came onto the team midway through this Olympiad, and before that point there was psychologist Chris Shambrook, who'd been with the team for multiple Olympics, and he was great at being on the end of the phone if you wanted to chat through a new way of thinking about something. Around racing in particular, we might do some visualization as a crew, and there's definitely an increased emphasis on I know quite a few of the athletes use tools like Headspace and the Calm app and things like that to practice some mindfulness techniques and things like that, so that you can, because I think part of the challenge with rowing is it's not really a game. It's in the midst of the racing, part of the result's going to be determined by just how much pain you can put yourself through, and there's not a whole lot to distract yourself from with that. So it's about kind of partly for some people, and everyone's got different techniques. Some people talk about like they move towards the pain, like they know that it's a sign that they're working at the right level almost. Other people would try to be in a kind of almost like flow state where they're barely conscious. Like if they let if something slipped in how they're thinking, then they'd suddenly be really aware of just how much pain they were in, but you're almost able to kind of your focus shifts from that and onto something else, whether it's kind of focusing on the technical model that you're needing to recreate, or what the race means, like the reason why you're pushing that hard and hurting so much, or how the race is playing out and how you're needing to respond, or the fact that you're doing this alongside other people who are also in a lot of pain, so you don't want to let them down, and that kind of thing.
No, absolutely, and it seems obviously all sport and no doubt sort of rowing, from what you say there, has come a long way over the years with sports science and psychology and technology as well. It's sort of moving things along rapidly. But in terms of your own race preparation, is it sort of technical in terms of you speak to the coach? Obviously, there's only so much you can give away, but do you sort of have a tactical sort of discussion about how you're going to go about?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. No, I don't think I'll be giving anything away. And so that, all teams would be discussing tactics, whether it's like, if you've got a particularly fast start, then your tactic may revolve around like really blasting out at the start and front loading the race, so that you can, because in rowing, like, you're looking backwards down the course, so if you can get out and create a lead, then in some ways you have the upper hand, because you can see your opponents, and it does get a bit tricky if you let the crews you're racing move through you to kind of a length or two boat lengths away, then it's very difficult for whoever's making the kind of tactical calls to judge how big the gap is without really looking around and kind of disrupting the rhythm and things like that. So there are definite advantages to, like, in some ways, when we do a test on the rowing machine, the best results tend to be quite evenly paced. So you respect the fact that it's 2 kilometres and takes about 6.5-7 minutes, rather than 250 metres, which takes like, I don't know, a minute, more or less. But in a water, in like a proper Olympic style race, or World Championships, people play different hands. So you would probably never pace, if you're trying to get your your best time. And some crews you see, like the women's 8 in Rio, they never had a particularly kind of electric start. They'd often be, I think they were maybe in last place at the halfway mark at that Olympics. I think they'd been the same at the European Championships earlier that year, but they'd built themselves into a rhythm so that when the people who'd put too much in too early started to falter, they were able to move through. But as I say, because of the fact that you can't see who you're racing if you're significantly down, that's quite it's not an approach that most crews would go for, I'd say.
Yeah, and that's really interesting. Now that the listeners find that interesting too. And I mean, I live up the road to a rowing. They do rowing. They do all sorts of water sports. And sometimes I sort of, when I go for a walk around the lake, I'll sort of watch the sort of rowers and think. Obviously, there's various levels, no doubt, that sort of are in there. But I just find it really intriguing in terms of how they go about pacing themselves and the psychology. If someone gets in front, I suppose, I guess in one sense, you're going to know a bit about the opposition, I would think, Melissa, when you're competing, whereas say you're not sort of turning up without any knowledge. Is that the case? You've got a bit of an idea about how the opposition sort of go about doing what they do, or?
Yeah, often. I think because there are quite a lot of different disciplines, it's not I guess when you're Usain Bolt and you're racing 100 metres, the same sort of people tend to be your opposition. That can sometimes be the case with rowing, but actually, because as a sculler you could be competing in the single, the double, or the quad, and in sweep rowing where you've just got one, or you could be competing in the 8, the 4, or the pair, and actually some athletes can switch across disciplines. It means that there's often quite a turnover of which athletes are in which boat, and I think that can mean there are some combinations that stay the same, like Glavin Stanning, who I was talking about in the pair, and people would be able to watch back like 8 years worth of their races, or maybe like 5-6 years of their races going into the Rio racing, and they'd have quite a sense of how the two of those athletes raced. But a lot of the time it will become clearer as the season goes on. So normally in a kind of World Championship year or an Olympic year, you'd have 3 World Cups, and for European countries, the European Championships in the racing season before you got to that World Championships. And so you'd have raced the crews whilst not every country goes to every World Cup. You'd have gone to at least a couple probably. And so it's likely by the time you get to the World Championship you'd have some idea of the different crews' forms. But there's still a lot. I'd say there's still a reasonable amount of change that happens between, because rowing's so reliant on athletes working together, unless you're in a single, there can be a lot of progress made, or sometimes deterioration, between the final World Cup and then the World Championships. So actually you find that so our races would go kind of heat. It depends how many crews there are, but you'd normally have a heat, then maybe a rep, then either quarter-final, and then kind of semi-final, final. So you could have between, if there are very few, so in the 8s racing sometimes there's only 5 or 6 crews, which means that it would essentially go straight to an A final, but they have a race for lanes and then the final. So you could have between 2 and 5 races normally in a regatta, and there will be quite a lot of learning that goes on, even at the kind of World Championship, or this year the Olympics. I expect there'd be quite a lot of learnings between the start of the Olympic regatta and the end, because all of these athletes have had so few opportunities in the last 24 months. All of our racing got cancelled last year, so athletes have had comparatively few opportunities to race internationally for quite a period of time. Absolutely,
and in terms of, that's really interesting and informative, Melissa, in terms of your own sort of career as a rower, I mean, what are your aspirations that you can share with our listeners sort of moving forward? No doubt you're very ambitious and you're obviously very talented and got a lot of ability. Do you have any sort of specific aspirations for yourself sort of moving forward, or?
I think at the moment, what I've been really grateful for is that GB rowing has I'm essentially on a medical stream at the moment, rehabbing different injuries, and they're kind of giving me a bit of space to work out what the next steps are. So actually over the last few months, a big focus for me has been the environmental work I've been doing as part of Champions for Earth. And I think that's definitely, looking ahead into the Paris Olympiad, that's definitely something that I'd want to still be quite a core part of what I'm doing in that time.
Absolutely. And you mentioned their Champions for the Earth and being a team leader. Can you tell our listeners a little bit about what that is? What sort of does Champions of the for the Earth involve?
Yeah, so it's a bit of a long name. Champions for Earth is an organisation that basically really believes that athletes can be brilliant ambassadors for the planet and advocates for sustainability. And it was set up by an Olympic champion, Etienne Stott, Etienne, and an ex-rower, Dave Hampton, in about 2018. And then last year, I joined the team around kind of March, April, and over the summer we wrote a letter encouraging a green recovery and wrote it to the Prime Minister, and we had over 300 GB Olympians and Paralympians sign it, household names like Mo Farah and Paula Radcliffe and Becky Adlington, and Redgrave, the Brownlee brothers, over 40 Olympic and Paralympic champions, and it got picked up by over 200 stories, media with a potential reach of 343 million people. So at that stage, I kind of felt like the hypothesis that athletes could be really impactful had kind of been met, and I know that there are other really amazing organisations doing this kind of work as well. There's the kind of British Association of Sustainable Sport, there's Big Plastic Pledge, which is run by Olympic champion Hannah Mills, there's an organisation called Protect Our Winters, there's another called Sport Positive. There's this really growing scene of individuals and organisations who recognise that athletes have this huge platform. I mean, Rio, I think, was watched by 3.6 billion people, 3.5 billion people follow football, 2.5 billion people follow cricket. So in terms of trying to get environmental messages communicated in a way that kind of draws on some of the best of what humans do, because sport is all about a kind of people driving themselves to be ambitious and resilient and pursuing a long-term goal, but knowing that they have to deliver their best every day in order to be their best at that point. And all of those things map so readily onto how we'd need to be approaching this climate crisis, and that it seems like a real opportunity to channel athletes and sports in that direction as these advocates.
No, absolutely. It seems like some really great work and some great people involved, and I suppose just sort of finally, people listening in thinking that they may try their hand at rowing, but I can imagine that it can be, I wouldn't say sort of nerve-wracking in one sense, but I guess it's one of the things really where it's sort of getting to the club and sort of making contact. And what would you say to any sort of anyone of any age really that sort of is considering rowing, and what are your sort of thoughts on that, Melissa? What any sort of words of wisdom around that?
Yeah, I would say firstly, a benefit of rowing is often the clubs are of quite a manageable scale. Some clubs in London, say, might have 6, 7, 8 men's crews and women's crews, but a lot of clubs will have kind of 2, maybe 3 crews that row regularly. So that's kind of, if you've got 8 people per crew, you're looking at like 24, 25 people on each side, so maybe like a squad of 50, 60. But once you're part of a crew, and especially because there's this learn to row scheme where you'd be put into a crew of other learners, it means that actually you get to quickly form a connection with a reasonably close group of people. And I certainly found, like, I've been someone who was, really, as I said, really poor at sport growing up, and it was a massive thing to me to realise that actually quite easily simply by going down to a rowing club. I could within like a week or two be in a crew with other people who are just kind of learning together and learning to push themselves. You don't have to be, like, much as I said, a lot of rowing is about kind of embracing pain. It absolutely doesn't have to be, and that's something that everybody, like, I've always seen it as a positive thing rather than a negative thing. It's exciting to learn bit by bit how to push yourself in that way, and doing it alongside people is such a brilliant way to learn to access that part of you that I didn't know I had, and I think most people don't know that they have until they're kind of given the opportunity to try. But I would definitely encourage people, like, there's absolutely nothing lost by just typing in, like, I think the British Rowing website probably has pointers for how you find out rowing clubs that are near you, and as I said, their Love Rowing charity is definitely doing a lot of work in this space, so I do think that people would be kind of welcomed, and if that doesn't work out, you can always hop on the Champions First website, and my email address is up there, so do email me, and I'd try to kind of put in a good word for you and straighten things out, because I do think it's really anybody who has rowed and that has been in the sport, I think, feels really invested in other people getting to enjoy it too.
Absolutely. And just on the Champions for Earth, you mentioned the website. If people want to sort of know more about that, what is the website itself, so they can maybe look and find out more about the initiative? Yeah,
it's literally www.championsfirst.org, I think. I'll double check.
Yeah, no problem. We can put a link in.
But we're at Champions for Earth on Twitter, the same on Instagram. The 4 is a 4 for the social media, like Champions 4, number 4.
Oh, okay. Brilliant.
But in terms of the website, it's just all in normal letters. And then we've got a project running at the moment, Ollie Earth Plus, which is about bringing a positive environmental legacy to the GB participation in the Olympics this summer. So that will also be kind of going up on Instagram and Twitter, and we're launching the online platform in the coming weeks. So anybody who's interested in our work, please look out for that as well, because it's something I'm really excited about.
No, that's brilliant. We really want to thank you for coming aboard the show. Melissa, it's been really interesting, and now that listeners has really found it interesting and sort of fascinating in terms of your own sort of career and the work you do, Champions for Earth as well. It's been fantastic having you on the show. We wish you every success, and thanks again for coming aboard the show. That was Melissa Wilson, GB rower and team leader for Champions for Earth, doing some great work, and we wish her all the very best in her career moving forward. Joining us on the Friday Sports Show, Salford City Radio 94.4 FM, with your host, Jimmy Petruzzi.